So, I'm here to talk to you about writing your memoir. And I have a personal prejudice that everybody ought to do that. It can be very simple or it can be very complex. That's up to you as the individual. But it's important. We all have a story to tell. We are all living a story. And it needs to be honored, and you need to do that. So, your story is about your hopes, your dreams, your accomplishments, and your failures. They all matter. They matter to you, and they matter to the people who follow you. Now, two of my favorite writers of memoir are Robert Fulghum, who's probably the most famous for everything I ever needed to know I learned in kindergarten, and a man named Arthur Gordon, who was a former editor of the Reader's Digest, and he was the author of one of my favorite books, which is called A Touch of Wonder. And it's essays all about his life. And both of these men wrote wonderful, wonderful stories. They could make you laugh, make you cry, and showed how important it is to tell your story. So Fulghum says, "You may never have proof of your importance, but you are more important than you think. There are always those who couldn't do without you. The rub is that you don't always know who." So why write a memoir? Most of us belong to a circle of individuals who find themselves in the oldest generation of their family. You are the oldest generation. Not a week goes by that I don't wish I could ask my parents something. There's all these things that we never found out, and neither one of them kept a journal of any kind whatsoever. So there is no way to find out. My brother John is here, and he and I sometimes figure out some of the details because I knew part of it and he knew part of it, and together we put together what we think was probably correct. But most of the questions go unanswered because there's nobody left above us who was there who could tell us what happened when we were a kid, or to the people that maybe we never even knew. So there you are. So how do you begin to write a memoir? Now that I've told you, you gotta do this. You begin the simplest way I know how. Well, don't do that. Silly thing, here we go. You begin the simplest way I know how, and this is what I'm going to teach you to do tonight. You begin with a timeline. You make a simple timeline. Now we're going to talk about Susan Nichols because she doesn't exist. And therefore none of these things in here happen to me or anybody else that I know, so it is nobody's story, so we can talk about it. So Susan Nichols' story began in 1952, and her timeline finishes at 2019 at this point because I suggest that you do it in decades. Now, if you do it on a computer like this, you can cram it all up like that because as you fill it in, the computer gives you more and more and more space. If, however, you are not a computer person, you can still do this. And you can do it in a notebook. And you can do it in a little notebook, or you can do it in a somewhat bigger fancy notebook. You can do it in a regular old 3-ring binder like you used in high school. And I would suggest if you're using paper, put one decade at the top of one piece of paper, and then the next decade at the top of the next one, because then as you fill it in, you keep adding blank paper behind that decade. Also, if you're doing it in paper rather than on a computer, don't worry that it gets a little bit out of order in the decade. Maybe you've filled page 1, and then you remember something that was important out of the second year of that decade, and there's no space there. Well, just go to the next page and write it in. It's all blocked into that one decade. People will find it. It'll be okay. So don't make it any harder than it needs to be. Then what you do with your timeline is you just kind of start filling it in. So Susan has written down when she was born, date, time, place it happened, her parents' names, and then the next thing she thought about was, oh, kindergarten. School is a big deal to me. I wanted to go to school. I was excited. And I started kindergarten in 1957, and I went to Thomas Jefferson Elementary School. And then in 1963, now in her second decade, they moved to a new house. So she wrote that down, and she wrote down she had to write now had to go to a different junior high, which meant, a change in her life. Started high school, 10th grade, so it was a 10, 11, 12 high school, like I went to. And then she graduated, began secretarial training, moved to Dayton, got a job at National Cash Register, married Patrick Anderson, daughter's born, getting here to the 80s, son Patrick is born, and at that point, that's what she's done so far, okay? So now, a funny thing happens when you start writing your memoir. You start thinking about these big kind of milestones in your life that we all have. We got born, we maybe got siblings, we went to school, at some point we left school, maybe we go to college, we get jobs, maybe we form a marriage, or maybe we don't, maybe we join a convent. I mean, we do whatever we do, but these things happen, and those are kind of the milestones, and those are the first things that will come to you as you start writing this down. But then this funny thing happens. You start remembering stuff. You start sometimes waking up in the middle of the night and going, I didn't wear the pink dress to that, I wore the blue one. And so then my suggestion there is keep a pen and pencil at the bedside, or a pencil and a pad at the bedside, so that when you wake up in the night remembering something, you can jot a few notes down and go to sleep, because in the morning you won't remember, it'll be gone. And then you'll be going, I know I remembered something really important and I can't remember what it was. So write it down. And it's okay to write on anything and then just somehow get it back to your notebook or your computer so you can enter it into your timeline. But what will happen is your timeline will suddenly start growing because of that. So now we see that she puts in more about her brother. I liked him much better than my friend Roberta's baby sister Sherry. Sherry pulled hair. Jimmy was sweet and good. Okay? And then she talked about how she loved school and started playing school with her brother Jimmy. And then she remembers, kind of a bad time in life that their dad was injured at work and spent most of the summer in bed, and so she and her brother were taken to stay with their grandparents so mom could stay home and take care of daddy. And talks about what they did there and how it felt, and that they got to spend the next 2 summers there. So it's starting to shape up now and become more of a story. In high school, she remembers that it was okay, but there was lots of homework. I didn't like math at all. Algebra was my worst subject. 68, had her first real boyfriend, but they were more friends than anything else, and they had a good time. Graduated high school, and then she goes on to talk about she liked those classes much better, and she remembered she had the highest speeds in her typing and shorthand classes. Now these are the kind of things, these are just ordinary data about life. But if you were this woman's child and she has now passed away and there's no one to tell you the stories about her life that she never got around to telling you, now you've got this. You've got this. And grandchildren like that who definitely aren't old enough to even ask the questions oftentimes when they've lost their grandparents, they would like to know that. So she starts just filling her story out more and more. And she will start remembering more and more things that she didn't remember. And this will grow and grow and grow. And it can take a short time, it can take a long time. It doesn't really matter. What matters is getting it down. And then I think as it goes on, then what you can do, if you're doing it on a computer, you can just scan your pictures and pop them in. And then you have pictures in your narrative. These are thanks to the great Google. So they have little things on them because they aren't really anybody we know. But now we have pictures of the babies, and she's talked about what it was like living on the farm and going swimming and stuff. And there's a picture of the farmhouse that she found somewhere. She puts pictures of boyfriend in there that she probably scanned out of her. And then she has a picture of her wedding. So that's how this process grows. Now, if you are like most people, you aren't writing a book. You're never going to ask someone to publish this. And if that's the truth, you don't have to do anything more than this. Just keep adding to this timeline as you remember things. or because your sister came to visit and your sister tells you a story that you never knew. So you go and you put that in your timeline, because now you know something else that happened in the family that you didn't know to put in the story. So you add it in there. And it can stay on your computer, you can print it out and put it in a notebook, or maybe it's in a notebook because you hand wrote it. But it's all there together for the people that follow you to be able to know something about the family history. One of my cousins did quite a lot of study on family history, and I learned a fair number of things from him about the broader family on my mother's side because of all the work that he had done. And my brother and I have dozens of second and third and 27th cousins in the Midwest, and we don't know any of them. You know, we don't know any of them. My mother used to write to all these people, but we didn't know them, and it just kind of all went away. And by the time you got to the point where you thought, gee, I should have followed up with these people, you look at a calendar and realize, oh, they're not there anymore either, are they? Unless they're living to be 152 years old, which they probably aren't. So this is the important thing, I think, to remember, is the importance of your story and how easy it is to tell it and to keep it. Now, if you actually want to write a book, you know, maybe you've had an amazing life and you really want to write your book, there are ways that then you can easily take this and change it into a book. And there's a lot of ways of doing that. And if anybody's actually interested, you can call me up. I'll be glad to talk to you about it. It's also true that sometimes people go, well, I'm in this pretty big family, and I really would like to polish it up a little bit and get it printed so I can give out, you know, I want 37 copies to give to the extended family members. And that too, now in the world of wonderful, fast publishing, you can do that. You can actually go to some company online, upload your manuscript, and they will send you however many books you wanted at so much per book. And I did that for a friend of mine when I wrote his memoir. We ordered 200 of them from a company named Digipod in the Midwest somewhere, and they were great, and they finished it. So Arthur Gordon, who's one of my two favorites I told you about, he says words are just little black marks on paper, just sounds in the empty air, but think of the power they have. They can make you laugh or cry, love or hate, fight or run away. They can heal or hurt. They can even come to look and sound like what they mean. Angry looks angry on the page. Ugly sounds ugly when you say it. So the power of words is very great, and that power belongs to all of us. And as my closing comment to you, during all my years as a writer, I had found this in one of Robert Fulghum's books, I think All I Really Need to Know. And he had been sent this by somebody, and I kept it over my desk. I believe that imagination is stronger than knowledge, that myth is more potent than history, that dreams are more powerful than facts, that hope always triumphs over experience, that laughter is the only cure for grief, and I believe that love is stronger than death. So.
All right.
Any questions? Okay.
You have inspired me.
Good. Call me up if you want to do this. I'll be happy to help you.
I would love to do that, but I have a problem with how did I feel, or what were my thoughts as each of these wonderful things. I've had an amazing life. Now, how did I feel about that? I think I have trouble with that.
Well, I think that what I found when I started working on my own was that in the early stages, it was pretty bare bones. It was a lot more just a list of facts.
Just the stuff.
And then as time goes on, you really do start getting in touch with those experiences again. And it becomes easier over time then to write about how you felt. And you also find yourself you may choose to edit some of that feeling out. Maybe you feel, if I put down how I really felt about that person, that could be hurtful, and no one really needs to know that but me. And so you may choose not to say it. And that's okay too. It's your story, and you have the right to tell the way you want to tell it and as much of it as you want to tell it, to tell other people. That is your story. The bare facts of the matter, the dates, the times, the places, that's pretty general. And is pretty easy to put down. But yeah, as you start getting into feelings, it can get harder to put it down. But part of it is talking it through. Only you're talking it through on paper instead of with someone else. But think about what you would say if you were talking to your best friend about what it was like to have that happen, and then maybe it'll become easier to put the words down.
That's a good idea.
Have you ever tried software where you speak and then it types?
I have not, because one of my blessings in life is that although I was a nurse for many years, I started out as a secretary, and I type about 125 words a minute. And so I can pretty much type as fast as it's coming anyway, and so I haven't. But certainly there are very good softwares out there now that allow you to just talk, and it learns your speech pattern, and it learns to spell the words correctly and do it. And that's a very good technique, particularly if it's hard for you to write or too slow for you to type it, then yeah, record it. I did a memoir for a friend of mine, and what we did is he and I sat together, and he just told me the story of his life over about 6 meetings that we held, and I recorded it all. And then I transcribed it. He never had to write anything down. And then this was a man who had lived an amazing life. I mean, he built the helmets and the seats for the first astronauts. And he designed cars with Harley Earl at General Motors back in the day. Cool. And he designed the thing that allows an airline pilot to get his oxygen mask on in under 5 seconds if the pressure goes out of the cabin. He did amazing things in his life, and it was great fun to write it. But that was something he couldn't do. He could sculpt. He was a magnificent sculptor. But write something down, that wasn't going to happen. But he wanted his story told, and so he hired me to do it. And using the spoken word was how he was able to do it. He was a good storyteller. He just couldn't write them down.
Did you ever assemble a time capsule? Do you know what they are?
Yeah, I do. And I did one in high school. I don't have one now.
We did one when I was in 3rd grade. We put one together. I've often wondered, what it's like to be there when they opened it.
Yeah. And did everything in there survive? Did people know what they were? Yeah.
If you do share the story, how do you prepare yourself if people repeat that story and say, that's not going to happen? I mean, is there something you can do to kind of make yourself strong enough to know that your story is your story?
Don't get the FBI. Yeah, there's no guarantees about memory. John and I will laugh sometimes because we'll remember the same thing, but not quite the same way, because we both experienced it differently. And so over time, memories do shape themselves. And I think you just have to say to people, that's the way I remember it. If you remember it differently, that's okay. But that's how I remember it, and that's how I'm telling my story.
Do you have a photographic memory for visual scenes that makes it easier for you to write? Can you picture things in your mind's eye and then...
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. I was just always born talking and telling stories, so...
And in your family, did people like to tell stories?
Yeah. I grew up in a family where we did talk and tell stories. Yeah.
So, you're talking about a personal history here, and one of the things that I've seen recently is very important, especially to get oral histories recorded for historical purposes. And even the mundane can be very important when you're creating a picture of what was happening at a specific times in history. So when people are doing their personal histories, they shouldn't be afraid to put just general information in there, because it really does paint a complete picture about what was going on in a point in time. And I hope more people will do this type of thing, because it is important when it comes to creating not just a history for your family, but a history for community and overall record of what was going on.
I mean, part of our history is, where were you on 9/11? Were you when Kennedy was assassinated? What do you remember of those events? How did they affect your life? And that is part of the overall history as well as your own history. And so it's important to include that. One of my favorite examples of what you're talking about is the Firefox books. And I don't know if anybody here has
Oh,
ever
I
read
have,
about
I have a whole bunch of those.
Yeah,
They're
and
amazing.
someone went out into Appalachia
Yeah.
and took oral histories from all the elderly people out there who were still doing things in those communities with no electricity and running water and stuff, the way they had been done for hundreds of years. And they still knew how to do that, and they told the story of, how do you hang a door so that it doesn't sag in the frame when you don't have power tools and all that to do it? How do you can food safely? How do you do that? And the books are fascinating, and they save for us knowledge that otherwise would be totally lost. So we're all part of that time capsule that makes up the history of the country. And the more people who put it down in some form and pass it on, then I think the better we will do. We could actually at some point become not only a creature that has memory, but we might learn how to learn from that and not keep making the same mistakes over again.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
was it
Yeah,
What a good idea.
I don't know about that.
What a great idea. I love that idea.
But I do think
Arthur
the
has a
memory is
question.
important. Yeah, Arthur.
Well, I started out doing, as you know, that memoir thing. It was instigated by some friends who said, well, that happened to you, why don't you write it up? And I did. And then, as you pointed out, things then begin to blossom or grow. And there's so many funny things that you said that are interlocking here. An old friend was dying, and he had an interesting life. And he wanted someone to tell it for him. It was very much your situation. We started having lunch together. Must have spent 50 hours at lunch. Almost always in the same restaurant, which is kind of fun because the wait staff got to know us pretty well. And we recorded everything. And then I sat down and I wrote my memoir. And then that wasn't enough in order to make a real novel. And so the first part is autobiographical, and the other 2/3 steal from his life. They take pieces from Mike's life, integrate them into my life, but it's not me, it's another character of a different name. And it ended up as a novel.
Yeah.
And it emerged very much in the way you're describing. Only instead of being a timeline, it was a restricted time frame.
Yeah.
It was actually only about 10 months, but that gave it the leverage to make the rest of it happen. So the process is very much like at least for me, it was very much like
I
what you
use
described.
timelines sometimes when I'm writing, because if I'm writing fiction, I belong to the Ray Bradbury School of Fiction Writing, where you start at the beginning of the story, and the only thing that you get to do as the author is the ending first. I mean, I don't often know how my story's going to end until I'm getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And I found using timelines kept me out of trouble, kept me from those places where if you ever read a book and you realize as you get toward the middle of it, wait a minute, if this information was accurate, that woman got married at 7 and had twins at 10, and obviously there is a continuity error here in this book. And I have found that using timelines for my fictional characters helps me avoid the continuity errors.
That's really interesting because I started writing this from the perspective of someone sitting here today and writing it as a retrospect, and that did not work. I had to go back to the actual timeline and live it through that way, and that worked.
And that worked.
The other was just awkward. It was
Yeah.
just all wrong.
Yeah, just a lot of memories. Well, thank you, Barb.
You're very